Step into the foggy streets of Victorian England, where gas lamps flicker over cobblestones, and the air carries a hint of coal smoke, horse dung, and scandal. A world that prided itself on manners, decorum, and moral superiority. Yet beneath that stiff collar and polished bonnet, there existed a labyrinth of bizarre, often absurd rules that governed every aspect of daily life. These weren't just social suggestions. They were laws, customs, and unspoken expectations that could make or break a reputation, ruin a family, or land someone in the stocks for daring to sneeze at the wrong moment. Imagine being a visitor in this era, wandering into a drawing room where everyone is seated according to strict gender and rank etiquette, where a misplaced bow or an uncalled-for remark could cause an uproar. Or picture walking into a public park, only to find that feeding the pigeons, or worse, whistling at them, might get you into trouble with the authorities. The Victorians were obsessed with order, but their order often tipped into the absurd. What we would see as trivial, or even laughable, was once the backbone of society. And it didn't stop at social niceties. Laws and regulations dictated how people dressed, ate, courted, and even coughed in public. Children, for example, were expected to behave like miniature adults. Play was not just discouraged, it was regulated. Girls were taught to sit with perfect posture and avoid using their imagination too freely, while boys learned to suppress curiosity that might appear improper in public. Adulthood, meanwhile, was a minefield of ritual. Courtship was a delicate dance of letters, glances, and social approval, where breaking the invisible rules could ruin a marriage before it began. Then there were the health regulations and hygiene rules, which ranged from the surprisingly sensible to the outright bizarre. The Victorians obsessed over cleanliness, yet were terrified of touching water with certain objects. They debated over the proper time to wash, the correct length of undergarments, and even the proper way to spit on the street without offending a neighbor. Every movement, every utterance seemed to have a prescribed rule attached. And yet, despite this rigid structure, or perhaps because of it, Victorian society was a playground of eccentricities. Some rules were created to impress, some to control, and some simply existed because someone, somewhere, thought they should. These strange, often laughable rules created a world that was at once meticulously ordered and wildly chaotic, a society obsessed with appearances, yet secretly fascinated by the ridiculous. In the chapters to come, we will wander through parlors, streets, and courtrooms, exploring the rules that defined and occasionally imprisoned Victorian life. From manners that could kill reputations to health obsessions that could ruin your dinner party, we'll uncover the bizarre logic of a world that believed in decorum above all else, yet often made little sense. Victorian England was a society of extremes, a place where the line between proper and preposterous blurred into fog and gaslight. And once you know the rules, you'll see just how strange life could be if you dared to follow them. The moment you stepped out into a Victorian street, you were already breaking 100 invisible rules, and the city would not let you forget it. London was a beast of cobblestones, gas lamps, and horse-drawn carriages that galloped like nervous predators. The air was thick, not just with smoke and fog, but with the weight of expectation. Every gesture, every glance, every step carried meaning. To survive, or even just to walk without social condemnation, you needed a manual, preferably written by someone who thought human behavior should be measured with a ruler and a pocket watch. Let's start with the streets themselves, because in Victorian England, walking wasn't just walking. Footpaths, pavements, and even the very cobblestones were ruled by unspoken laws. Women, particularly, were expected to navigate the public space with delicate precision. A proper lady never looked a man directly in the eye for longer than a polite instant. She avoided the gaze of strangers altogether. If she happened to bump into someone, a frequent occurrence on narrow streets, she had to apologize with a careful bow, her fingers pressed to her chest, as if she'd committed a sin rather than simply sharing space with another human. A gentleman, meanwhile, had the equally delicate task of tipping his hat, but not too low, not too quickly, and never to a woman who might misread the gesture as flirtation. Fail at these calculations, and gossip spread faster than a street urchin selling newspapers. And then there were the carriages, those black, gliding boxes of social status and danger. Crossing a street required timing, grace, and an almost ritualistic awareness. Jump too soon, and you risked being trampled or scandalized. Wait too long, and you risked being labeled indecisive, lazy, or frightfully clumsy. One misstep could end in a collision, or worse, a whispered judgment that followed you home like a persistent fog. The Victorians believed that even accidents carried moral weight, because surviving the street without injury implied self-control, discipline, and an understanding of your social role. Inside, the rules became even stranger. Victorian homes were theaters of conduct, each room a stage for ritualized behavior. Entering a drawing room required a calculation of posture, expression, and verbal restraint. Speak too soon, and you were brash. Too late, and you were dull. Chairs were not chosen at random. To sit where you pleased was an insult to the hierarchy of the house. The proper lady of the house might even supervise the placement of guests, directing men and women like pieces on a social chessboard. And the furniture itself, curtains, carpets, even the placement of a teacup, was an extension of these rules, each object a subtle measure of your propriety. Spilling tea was more than a mistake. It was evidence of moral weakness, poor upbringing, and possibly an inability to comprehend the civilized world. Victorian rules were not confined to posture and etiquette. They extended into the everyday acts of living. Eating, for example, was an ordeal of almost ritualistic absurdity. There were the proper times to dine, the correct sequence of utensils, and the exact manner of consuming every course. Soup was slurped quietly to avoid vulgarity. Bread was broken with fingers, but only in a certain way. And dessert demanded restraint, lest you appear gluttonous. Even chewing could betray your class. One miscalculated crunch could brand you a barbarian, a mistake not easily forgiven in a society obsessed with appearances. And then there were the rules that governed speech, arguably the most dangerous minefield of all. Conversations were rehearsed battles. Interrupting, raising your voice, or laughing at the wrong moment could be social suicide. The language itself was coded. To call someone amiable might mean they were insufferably dull. To praise their spiritedness might hint at scandalous recklessness. Humor was permitted, but only if it adhered to the invisible grid of social safety. Satire or sarcasm, acceptable only when applied to the proper targets, never yourself, never your social betters. To misstep was to invite judgment, whispers, and the slow erosion of your reputation. Even more bizarre were the rules surrounding public health, which seemed to grow out of a mixture of genuine concern and sheer paranoia. Victorian England had a strange obsession with the human body and its supposed dangers. Spitting on the street was not merely unpleasant, it was legally punishable in many areas. Coughing loudly invited scorn, yet attending to it in private was an embarrassment in itself. Washing hands was encouraged, but the methods were endless, with prescriptions about soap, water temperature, and rubbing duration. Some rules were sensible, others were absurd, like the insistence that certain objects, umbrellas, walking sticks, even hats, could carry disease merely by contact. Fear of contagion blurred with the obsession with etiquette, and suddenly, survival wasn't just about avoiding illness, it was about knowing the correct social response to potential germs. Children were also caught in this web of bizarre regulation. Play was limited, controlled, and surveilled. Boys and girls alike were drilled in posture, speech, and manners, often to the detriment of imagination or spontaneity. A child who laughed too loudly, touched objects in the wrong order, or expressed curiosity about the natural world risked scolding, or worse, moral condemnation. Schools, meanwhile, enforced strict routines, combining corporal punishment with an almost fanatical devotion to order. Even recess had rules. Games had to be properly structured, no roughhousing allowed, and certainly no questioning of authority. Childhood in Victorian England was a rehearsal for adulthood, where obedience was prized above joy. And speaking of adulthood, courtship and marriage were arenas of extreme regulation. Men and women engaged in what can only be described as ritualized chess. Letters were drafted carefully, glances were measured, and every meeting required careful choreography. Public displays of affection were unthinkable. Even private ones were subject to social and moral scrutiny. The rules governed everything from the length of a handkerchief to the proper spacing between partners during a promenade. Breaking the code could ruin reputations, ruin families, or invite a lifetime of whispers behind closed doors. Love was not spontaneous. It was an exercise in discipline, patience, and social calculation. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Victorian rules was how they combined the logical with the ludicrous. Some regulations were grounded in public health, social order, or genuine concern for decency. Others were born purely from tradition, vanity, or fear of embarrassment. Taken together, they created a society both meticulously ordered and absurdly constrained, a place where every action was weighed, measured, and judged. Walking through this world, you might feel trapped, suffocated by invisible chains. But there was also a strange thrill, a dark humor in navigating these absurdities. Imagine balancing proper etiquette while dodging horse dung, keeping your posture impeccable while avoiding gas lamps, and maintaining polite conversation while silently screaming at the sheer ridiculousness of it all. That was life in Victorian England, a delicate, often comical dance on a stage of fog, morality, and bizarre social law. And as you start to understand these strange rules, you'll see how deeply they penetrated every corner of life. From the streets to the parlor, from the dinner table to the schoolroom, the Victorians had codified behavior to such extremes that the act of simply existing required performance. Yet, for all the absurdity, there was method in the madness, a social logic that made perfect sense to those who lived by it, even if, from our modern perspective, it seems utterly surreal. In the chapters to come, we'll explore these rules in all their intricate, darkly humorous glory. We'll laugh, cringe, and marvel at the strange logic that shaped an entire era. Victorian life wasn't just strict. It was a theater of rules, a carnival of the absurd, a society where etiquette and obsession walked hand in hand. And as you journey deeper, you'll see just how strange surviving in this world could truly be. In Victorian England, appearances weren't just important, they were everything. A society obsessed with morality and respectability built an entire architecture of rules around the image of propriety, and no one exemplified this better than the social rituals surrounding clothing. The Victorians dressed not for comfort or personal preference, but for judgment, surveillance, and survival. Every button, every fold, every layer communicated a subtle message about class, virtue, and self-discipline. Misstep here, and you could be labeled careless, immoral, or downright scandalous. For women, clothing was a carefully constructed cage disguised as elegance. Corsets were mandatory for respectable ladies, binding the body in a manner that restricted movement but signaled virtue. A tightly laced waist didn't just create the hourglass silhouette beloved by society, it broadcasted that the wearer had control over her impulses and desires, that she understood the proper limits of femininity. Failing to lace properly, or worse, showing the slightest discomfort, could invite judgment from both peers and strangers. Petticoats multiplied beneath skirts, layers of starched cotton and silk creating a soft prison that muffled steps but amplified status. Jewelry was not mere decoration. Each brooch, cameo, and strand of pearls was a statement of wealth, taste, and moral standing. Overdo it, and you were gaudy. Underdo it, and you were poor, or morally deficient. Men fared little better. They were measured not only by their suits, but by the precision of their grooming. Facial hair followed fashion with almost religious devotion. Beards, mustaches, sideburns, all dictated by changing norms and social class. A gentleman's hat was a tool of both protection and social signaling. It could convey profession, respectability, or rebellious eccentricity. Gloves were mandatory in most public spaces, both for warmth and to prevent the contamination of one's moral and physical self. A man who failed to wear gloves, or worse, touched a lady's hand without them, risked scandal, as touch was an invisible transgression, a moral offense rather than a physical one. And then there were the rules surrounding footwear, which in the Victorian mind were far more significant than mere practicality. Shoes were a statement of status, cleanliness, and discipline. Scuffed boots implied laziness or carelessness. Tightly laced boots signaled self-control. Even the way a person walked could betray their upbringing. The faintest limp, an ungraceful step, or a careless shuffle was interpreted as a moral flaw, a failure to internalize society's invisible hierarchies. Clothing dictated behavior in ways that seem almost laughable today. Sitting, bending, or even lifting a hand carried layers of expectation. A lady might need assistance simply to descend stairs gracefully while keeping her skirts in perfect alignment. Men were expected to stride with authority, avoiding any movement that might seem indecorous or weak. Even turning one's head required subtle calculation. Look too directly, and you risked appearing flirtatious. Glance too briefly, and you seemed inattentive or dull. The act of moving through space was itself an exercise in social compliance. The rules extended to hair and grooming, which were treated as moral indicators. Women spent hours shaping, curling, and pinning their hair into elaborate arrangements, each coil and twist a subtle code of discipline. Men's hair had to be cut precisely, often by the clock, to signal that they respected order and hierarchy. Public perception was everything. The slightest misalignment or smudge could suggest moral laxity, even intellectual weakness. Victorian society equated outward order with inner virtue, and personal grooming became a public moral statement. But clothing wasn't the only arena where the Victorians' obsession with rules reigned supreme. The domestic sphere, home, hearth, and private space, was an equally stringent stage. Houses were meticulously organized, not just for comfort, but for the appearance of moral rectitude. Rooms were divided into zones according to social function: parlors for guests, drawing rooms for social display, kitchens for labor, and bedrooms for private reflection and family hierarchy. Each room had rules governing behavior, furniture arrangement, and even the manner in which objects were touched or used. For example, a visiting lady might be expected to sit in a particular chair at a precise distance from the host, with hands folded in a manner deemed appropriate. Moving without permission, touching items, or speaking out of turn could breach the invisible code of conduct. The Victorian obsession with domestic propriety extended to cleanliness. Homes were expected to be spotless, yet the methods for achieving cleanliness were convoluted, often bordering on the absurd. Carpets were beaten, windows washed obsessively, and floors scrubbed with mixtures designed to ward off germs, disease, and moral decay alike. Dust was more than a nuisance. It was a sign of negligence, a crack in the carefully constructed moral armor of the household. Failure to maintain cleanliness could result in whispers of slovenliness, laziness, or worse, a suspicion that one's family lacked virtue. Even servants were not immune. Household staff were expected to navigate the labyrinth of rules with near military precision. From timing the tea service perfectly to anticipating the whims of their employers, servants were constantly under scrutiny. They needed to move silently, speak sparingly, and anticipate social norms that even their masters sometimes forgot. A servant who misstepped, placing a chair slightly askew, serving a meal too hot or too cold, or using the wrong tone of voice, could find themselves shamed, fired, or relegated to the back of the social hierarchy. Every action was a test of obedience and understanding, a reflection of the rigid moral and social code that governed Victorian life. Public behavior, too, followed a strict moral calculus. Crossing a street, visiting a park, or even standing on a sidewalk was governed by layers of expectation. Walking alone as a woman invited suspicion. Walking with a man required measured interaction and distance. Talking loudly was frowned upon, laughter was tightly controlled, and displays of emotion were often read as moral weakness. Men and women were expected to move through public space like dancers in an invisible choreography, every step calculated to maintain social balance. And yet, amid all this rigidity, Victorian society thrived on performance. People adapted, exaggerated, and even secretly mocked these rules in private, while maintaining the public facade. The strictures created a theater of daily life, where everyone was both actor and audience. This obsession with order and appearance was, in part, a defense mechanism against the uncertainties of life. Disease, poverty, and social mobility threatened the social order, and rules, Absurd, elaborate, and often contradictory, offered a sense of control. Even personal hygiene was not immune to regulation. Teeth had to be brushed, hands washed at prescribed times, and clothing changed according to strict intervals. Public spitting, once a common habit, became socially and legally punishable, reflecting a broader fear of contagion and moral contamination. Coughing loudly in public was considered an affront to decency, yet secret remedies and private rituals existed to treat these natural bodily functions. Victorian hygiene was a mix of sense and superstition, blending genuine concern for health with elaborate social policing. Children, too, internalized these expectations early. From the moment they could walk and talk, they were drilled in manners, posture, and obedience. Play was carefully regulated to avoid impropriety, and even schooling emphasized order, discipline, and conformity over creativity or free thought. The Victorian child was a miniature adult in training, groomed for a lifetime of navigating complex, often contradictory social rules. By now, it's clear that in Victorian England, life was a constant performance. Every act, from dressing to walking to speaking, was imbued with meaning and subject to judgment. The rules were strange, sometimes absurd, but they shaped an entire society obsessed with appearances, propriety, and moral calculation. And while these rules might seem suffocating, they were also a form of entertainment, a stage for subtle rebellion, dark humor, and human creativity. Surviving, or even thriving, meant mastering the absurd, understanding the invisible, and laughing quietly at the ridiculous seriousness of it all. As we move deeper into this world, we'll see that the rules didn't stop at clothing, homes, and streets. They penetrated courtship, health, leisure, and even death itself. Victorian England was a land of extremes, where order and absurdity walked hand in hand, and navigating it required equal parts discipline, wit, and nerve. And as you'll discover, the deeper you look, the stranger the rules become. In Victorian England, manners were not merely polite suggestions, they were weapons, shields, and measures of survival all rolled into one. The social codes governing behavior were so intricate that even the slightest slip could become the talk of the town, whispered over tea and printed in the society columns. Every interaction was a test. How you spoke, where you looked, how long you paused, even how you breathed in public could betray your upbringing, your class, and, God forbid, your moral fiber. Let's begin with conversation, because in Victorian society, talking was a minefield of etiquette. One was expected to converse intelligently, but never boastfully, to express humor, but never offend, to show interest, but never intrude. Interruptions were a cardinal sin, yet failing to respond promptly was just as damning. Women, in particular, were judged on the subtlety of their speech. A lady who spoke too much was immodest, too little, and she was dull. Every word had weight. Even laughter was regulated. It had to be restrained, melodic, and directed appropriately. A giggle in the wrong moment could ruin a reputation. Men, meanwhile, had to master the art of the gentlemanly conversation, which meant providing wit, insight, and charm without ever seeming crude or unrefined. Compliments were another art form, and their rules bordered on the absurd. Praising someone's appearance required a careful calculation of tone and phrasing. Too effusive, and you risked appearing flirtatious. Too tepid, and you seemed indifferent. Even the act of responding to a compliment was codified. A proper response might include a demure bow, a brief acknowledgement, or a soft deflection of praise, all while maintaining the illusion of modesty. Misstep, and you became a topic of whispered gossip, your social standing teetering on the edge. Then there were introductions, which functioned as a subtle display of hierarchy and judgment. Being introduced incorrectly could insult someone's rank or imply a lack of proper connections. The Victorians had a hierarchy for introductions, the order of presentation, the manner of bowing or curtsying, the exact phrasing used, all followed an invisible but rigid code. A misstep here could signal ignorance, impertinence, or an attempt to overreach socially. In a society obsessed with status, even a minor error could have long-term consequences. Gestures, meanwhile, were just as regulated as speech. A hand placed incorrectly could signify aggression, flirtation, or disrespect. A nod too vigorous could appear mocking, too subtle, and it might go unnoticed. The tilt of the head, the angle of the shoulders, even the direction of the eyes were all carefully measured. Every gesture was read, interpreted, and judged. Public displays of emotion, crying, fainting, or even visible irritation were discouraged for the upper classes, who believed that composure signaled moral and intellectual superiority. Emotional expression was reserved for private spaces, behind closed doors, or in carefully staged performances like theater or literature. Social events themselves were governed by an equally intricate web of rules. Dinner parties, balls, and gatherings were not mere entertainments. They were exercises in observation, calculation, and performance. Seating arrangements were carefully orchestrated to maintain hierarchy. The host determined the order, taking into account rank, gender, and social connections. A misstep could be catastrophic. Sitting in the wrong chair, addressing the wrong person first, or using the wrong fork at the wrong time could all be interpreted as moral or social failure. Meals, like conversation, were choreographed to the tiniest detail, from the order of dishes to the proper pace of eating to the correct way of holding cutlery. Even leisure activities were not free from regulation. Walking in the park, attending the theater, or riding in a carriage all carried hidden rules. Parks, often considered places of morality and refinement, required women to maintain decorum at all times. Running, shouting, or even gesturing too broadly could attract censure. Men were expected to keep their hands out of their pockets, speak politely to strangers, and avoid anything resembling indecent behavior. Courting couples had to maintain a strict physical distance, with hand placement, walking pace, and conversational tone all monitored. Any deviation could result in whispers of impropriety. Etiquette extended into the written word as well. Letters were carefully composed instruments of social signaling. The choice of paper, ink, and handwriting style was as important as the content itself. Missives followed strict formulas: salutation, body, and closing, each with prescribed wording. A single overly familiar phrase or an improper signature could invite social ruin. Letters were expected to reflect moral character, refinement, and attentiveness to social hierarchy. Even the timing of correspondence mattered. Reply too soon, and you appeared desperate. Too late, and you were rude. But perhaps the strangest facet of Victorian social rules was the obsession with what we might now call micro-morality. Every tiny act had potential moral significance. Sneezing in public could be a breach of propriety. as could yawning without covering your mouth. Walking alone as a woman could be deemed reckless or immoral. Walking too close to a stranger could be interpreted as flirtation or worse. Social survival required constant vigilance, a hyper-awareness of your body, voice, and actions, and a near-constant mental calculation of how every move might be perceived. Victorian society also created absurd rules for bodily functions in public. The simple act of eating, drinking, or relieving oneself was fraught with moral and social danger. Drinking too eagerly from a glass could signal greed. Eating with too much gusto could suggest gluttony or ignorance. Public restrooms existed but were limited and segregated, creating dilemmas for women in particular who risked being seen, or even rumored, to act inappropriately simply by using such facilities. These rules extended to private spaces as well, with strict expectations about when and how one might attend to personal needs in a domestic environment. Fashion and manners intersected in even stranger ways when it came to mourning and social obligation. Widows were expected to wear black for extended periods, sometimes years, with layers of fabric that communicated grief, virtue, and endurance. Their behavior had to align perfectly with their attire. No laughter, no frivolity, no deviation from solemnity. Men, too, followed mourning rituals, though less stringently, but their attire and comportment still indicated moral strength and respect for social norms. Failure to adhere could result in whispers questioning character, family, and morality. Even death itself was governed by rules. Funerals were highly regulated events, with seating, attire, and processions reflecting social hierarchy and moral propriety. Expressions of grief were tightly controlled. Overt displays were acceptable only within prescribed bounds. Invitations, attendance, and even the order of speaking were all subject to the invisible hand of etiquette. Social life, it seemed, was inescapable even in death. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, these labyrinthine rules, Victorian England was a society of adaptation and quiet rebellion. People found ways to bend the rules without breaking them, to signal wit, intelligence, or eccentricity while still maintaining the appearance of propriety. A subtle joke in conversation, a carefully disguised flourish in attire, or a whispered secret at a gathering allowed for a controlled release of individuality. The absurdity of the rules created space for creativity, for quiet humor, and for survival strategies that were as clever as they were necessary. By understanding these rules, we begin to see the genius and the madness of Victorian social life. It was a world where every glance, gesture, and word mattered, a society where appearances could mean life or death for one's reputation, a civilization obsessed with order, control, and moral correctness, yet brimming with human ingenuity, subtle rebellion, and dark humor. Navigating it required intelligence, caution, and the ability to laugh quietly at the absurdity of it all. As we move forward, the rules become stranger still. They extend beyond streets, parlors, and dinners, infiltrating courtship, leisure, health, and even entertainment. The Victorian obsession with control, hierarchy, and morality knew no bounds. And the deeper we explore, the more surreal the world becomes, one rule bending into another, each more bizarre and fascinating than the last. Victorian society loved rules that seemed harmless at first glance, but in reality, they were traps for the unwary. One of the strangest arenas where this obsession with regulation revealed itself was in the realm of courtship and romance. Love, desire, and attraction were not private matters. They were subject to a complex grid of etiquette, morality, and social surveillance. In this era, even a glance could carry meaning, a letter could be a weapon, and a single misstep could ruin reputations for decades. For men, courtship was a high-stakes game, requiring charm, discretion, and meticulous observation. A gentleman could not simply approach a lady. He had to be properly introduced, usually through a mutual acquaintance, often under the scrutiny of family members. Public interaction without permission was considered scandalous, bordering on impropriety, or even harassment by today's standards. If a man attempted to speak to a woman without formal introduction, he risked social ostracization, gossip, or the polite but firm refusal to associate further. A single failed interaction could damage not only his reputation, but also that of his family, which in Victorian England could be socially catastrophic. Letters, meanwhile, were the currency of courtship, and their rules were bizarrely complex. A note of affection had to be carefully worded, often including indirect expressions of admiration, coded phrases, and subtle compliments that conveyed interest without seeming inappropriate. Overly effusive letters were considered improper, too restrained, and they suggested indifference or coldness. Every word was a gamble, and the timing of delivery was equally critical. A reply too swift could appear desperate, while a delay could signal disdain or incompetence in social understanding. For young women, writing letters involved a similar game, expressing interest without appearing forward, maintaining modesty while signaling curiosity, and ensuring that every word adhered to strict moral codes. Physical contact was a minefield. Public displays of affection were unthinkable, and even private gestures were tightly controlled. A man might offer his hand to a lady for a dance, but the slightest misplacement of fingers could be interpreted as either clumsy or indecent. Walking together required careful choreography. The spacing between partners, the pace of steps, the positioning of arms, and even the order of entering a room were all subject to scrutiny. One misjudged move could ignite whispers, speculation, or scandal, sometimes spreading far beyond the immediate social circle. Courtship also required mastery of nonverbal cues, an unspoken language of glances, tilts of the head, and subtle smiles. A woman's lowered eyes might signify shyness or modesty. A quick glance could hint at interest or defiance. Men were expected to interpret these cues with precision, while simultaneously concealing their own emotions behind a veneer of polite detachment. Misreading signals could have disastrous consequences. A too bold approach could be considered indecent, while excessive caution could lead to lost opportunities or social ridicule. Even attire played a critical role in courtship. Dresses were selected not just for beauty, but for signaling availability, virtue, and social standing. Accessories, gloves, fans, hats, and handkerchiefs were not mere decoration, they were communication tools. A subtle flick of a fan could indicate interest, dismissal, or playfulness, and the wrong gesture could be misinterpreted with long-lasting consequences. Men, too, had to dress according to these subtle codes of class, wealth, and taste, ensuring that their appearance conveyed propriety, respectability, and romantic intent without appearing ostentatious or improper. Balls and social gatherings were the ultimate courts of observation and judgment. Invitations were coveted, but attendance carried its own set of rules. Seating arrangements were orchestrated to reflect hierarchy, rank, and social connections. The timing of arrival and departure was critical. Arriving too early could be seen as aggressive or impatient. Arriving too late implied disrespect. Once inside, participants navigated an invisible web of etiquette, balancing conversation, dance, and observation. Every interaction, offering a dance, exchanging a compliment, or joining a conversation, required calculation, foresight, and a subtle understanding of social hierarchy. Dancing itself was ritualized and highly regulated. Each dance carried distinct rules for behavior, proximity, and movement. A misstep on the floor could signal lack of refinement, ignorance of social norms, or even moral failure. Couples had to maintain appropriate posture, follow prescribed steps, and execute subtle cues of deference or interest. The choice of partner, the manner of invitation, and even the timing of leaving the dance were all subject to judgment. For the socially inexperienced, a single error could lead to whispered critiques or permanent exclusion from elite circles. Romantic rejection was also codified. A gentle refusal required carefully constructed language, gestures, and facial expressions, ensuring that no social embarrassment occurred for either party. A direct no was considered too blunt, a source of shame for both the man and the woman. Instead, elaborate phrasing, subtle hand movements, and carefully timed excuses were deployed to navigate the delicate balance between rejection and social propriety. Failure to execute this ritual correctly could result in scandal, gossip, or permanent damage to social standing. Marriage proposals themselves were dramatic affairs governed by precise rules. The man, often with the approval of his family, presented a ring or token of affection, accompanied by formal speech and careful observation of protocol. The response, too, followed strict etiquette, gratitude, modesty, and a carefully calibrated expression of interest or refusal. Any deviation could cast doubt on moral integrity, social understanding, or family honor. Courtship, in essence, was a high-stakes performance, a constant negotiation of rules, emotions, and perception. Even after engagement, rules persisted. Couples were expected to avoid public intimacy, limit correspondence, and continue adhering to societal expectations regarding conduct, attire, and interaction. The period of engagement was itself a display of discipline and decorum, a rehearsal for the social scrutiny of marriage. The act of simply walking together, visiting friends, or exchanging gifts could carry social consequences if executed incorrectly. In Victorian England, love was never private. It was a highly monitored, tightly regulated spectacle. Perhaps the most curious aspect of these rules was their contradiction. Victorians simultaneously promoted emotional restraint and subtle displays of feeling, moral propriety and playful signaling, hierarchy and personal choice. Navigating this world required intelligence, social acumen, and constant vigilance. Every glance, gesture, and word had to be interpreted, weighed, and executed with precision. Those who succeeded were rewarded with social standing, potential marriage, and admiration. Those who failed faced gossip, ridicule, and social marginalization. In essence, Victorian courtship was an intricate dance on a stage of invisible rules, a world where love was both celebrated and policed, where emotion was both cherished and constrained. The absurdity of the regulations created a theater of behavior, allowing creativity, subtle rebellion, and dark humor to emerge. Participants learned to bend the rules, exploit nuance, and signal interest without violating propriety, mastering a social language that was as precise as it was convoluted. And while these rules may seem oppressive today, they were a reflection of the Victorian obsession with order, morality, and social hierarchy. Every gesture, every word, every interaction was a carefully constructed performance, designed to navigate the treacherous waters of social expectation. Courtship was not just about love, it was about survival, status, and mastery of the invisible codes that governed every aspect of life. As we continue, the rules grow stranger still. Beyond courtship lie regulations about leisure, health, public behavior, and even death itself. Victorian society's obsession with control was total, and its rules reached into the smallest corners of life. In the coming chapters, we'll uncover just how bizarre, elaborate, and darkly humorous these rules could be, revealing a civilization both meticulous and absurd, elegant and terrifying. If courtship was a complex dance of gestures and letters, leisure in Victorian England was an equally bewildering labyrinth of rules. The Victorians had an almost pathological obsession with morality and decorum, and their pastime activities reflected that obsession. Entertainment was not merely for amusement, it was a demonstration of taste, virtue, and social rank. How one spent free time was as heavily scrutinized as how one dressed or walked in public. A misstep in leisure could be just as damning as a breach of etiquette at a formal gathering. Take, for example, walking, which might seem innocuous today. Parks and promenades were arenas of subtle social theater, and the rules governing them were surprisingly strict. Women were expected to walk in modesty, keeping their hands folded or holding their skirts in a precise manner. Too wide a stride could imply aggression or impropriety, while a limp or hasty step might signal nervousness, ill-breeding, or even moral weakness. Men, meanwhile, were expected to walk with controlled grace, hands often gloved, posture erect, and eyes strategically cast, showing interest without appearing predatory. Couples had to maintain appropriate distance, never too close, never too far, each step a negotiation of propriety. Picnics and outings were also regulated events. Choosing a location, unpacking a meal, and seating participants involved social calculations. Certain foods were considered improper for public consumption, such as messy fruits or overly aromatic dishes. Sharing food was an exercise in etiquette. Who ate first, who offered what, and in what order, all followed subtle rules. A careless action, like biting into a tomato or spilling a crumb, could be interpreted as vulgarity, ignorance, or a failure of upbringing. Even the choice of utensils mattered. An unpolished knife or fork might suggest financial instability or moral laxity. The theater, a cornerstone of Victorian leisure, was another minefield. Attendance was not only about enjoying a performance, but about maintaining appearances. Box seating, dress codes, and the timing of arrival were all tightly controlled. Speaking or laughing at the wrong moment could attract disapproving glances or whispered critiques. Women were expected to sit with grace, fans strategically positioned, hands never flailing. Men were expected to suppress visible amusement or irritation, ensuring their reactions conformed to the moral expectations of their rank. Even applause was subject to regulation. Enthusiastic clapping could seem unrefined, while insufficient acknowledgement could be interpreted as a lack of taste or respect. Reading, of course, was a socially sanctioned leisure activity, but not without its own constraints. Certain literature was considered appropriate only for specific classes, genders, and ages. Novels featuring romance, crime, or political dissent were carefully categorized, and bookshelves often served as indicators of taste, intellect, and moral standing. For women, novels could be dangerous. Too much exposure to romantic intrigue or scandalous behavior might compromise their virtue or corrupt their sensibilities. Men, meanwhile, were expected to read works that reflected intelligence, discipline, and engagement with society. Improper reading was a moral misstep, a sign of negligence or foolishness. Games, too, were subject to strict regulation. Cards, for example, were acceptable only under certain circumstances. Gambling of any significant stakes was morally suspect, often associated with vice and ruin. Board games had prescribed rules and acceptable strategies, with victory achieved through skill and decorum rather than aggression or deceit. Children's games were monitored closely, as roughhousing or imaginative play was seen as potentially corrupting, leading to improper behavior in adulthood. Even sports like croquet, tennis, or riding were governed by strict codes. Clothing, posture, and conduct had to reflect moral and social propriety, leaving little room for spontaneous enjoyment. Social clubs were perhaps the most regulated form of leisure. Membership indicated status, and the conduct of members was scrutinized meticulously. Rules about arrival, seating, conversation, and even body language were enforced, both formally and informally. Breaking the rules could result in expulsion, gossip, or diminished social standing. Within these clubs, one had to navigate an intricate web of hierarchy, protocol, and expectation. Success required intelligence, observation, and a subtle understanding of the unspoken codes that governed human interaction. Even casual conversation in leisure contexts followed strict regulation. Jokes, gossip, and commentary were all subject to moral and social scrutiny. A story told with too much enthusiasm could appear frivolous, too little, and it risked being dismissed as dull or ignorant. Critique or disagreement had to be delivered with subtlety, often cloaked in humor or deferential language. The line between wit and offense was razor thin, and violating it could have repercussions far beyond a single conversation. And then there was music, which was both a source of enjoyment and a moral test. Public performances required decorum from both performers and audience numbers. Women were expected to play instruments gracefully, never showing strain or improper emotion. Men were expected to listen with measured attention, applauding with restraint. Even private music lessons had rules. Fingering, posture, and tone were closely monitored, as a display of poor technique implied moral and intellectual deficiency. Improper performance could bring social ridicule, while excellence was a tool for enhancing reputation and demonstrating refinement. Religious observance was intertwined with leisure, and Sunday, in particular, was a day heavily regulated by both social custom and law. Recreation, work, and public conduct were strictly monitored. Walking or conversing inappropriately could be interpreted as sin. Attire and demeanor had to reflect piety and respect. Church attendance was not merely spiritual, it was social theater, a demonstration of adherence to moral and societal norms. Failure to comply could result in gossip, subtle exclusion, or moral condemnation. Travel, too, was a regulated activity. When venturing outside the city, social rules dictated appropriate attire, behavior, and interaction with strangers. Women had to consider privacy, modesty, and propriety, often requiring companions to maintain decorum. Men had to observe hierarchies, anticipate social challenges, and display moral fortitude in the face of unfamiliar environments. Even train travel was a test: where to sit, how to interact with fellow passengers, and how to behave during delays all carried moral weight. A misstep could be noted, remembered, and recounted, potentially harming one's social reputation. Even death, the final leisure-free act, followed rules that reflected the same obsession with control, decorum, and social perception. Funerals were meticulously orchestrated, with attendance, attire, seating, and mourning behaviors strictly codified. Expressing grief was permitted only within narrow confines, and even excessive emotion was interpreted as weakness or moral failure. Wills, memorials, and burial practices reflected both social rank and adherence to proper ritual, turning even the inevitability of death into a stage for performance and judgment. Despite all these restrictions, Victorians found ways to navigate, manipulate, and even subvert the rules of leisure. Private amusement, quiet rebellion, and clever interpretation allowed individuals to enjoy themselves while maintaining the appearance of propriety. Humor, wit, and subtle improvisation became survival tools, letting people breathe amidst the relentless scrutiny of social expectation. Leisure was a paradox, an opportunity for pleasure bound tightly by the chains of morality, etiquette, and social hierarchy. By understanding these rules, we begin to see how deeply Victorian obsession with control penetrated daily life. Entertainment was not a simple respite from labor or obligation, it was a performance, a moral test, and a measure of social fitness. Every step, glance, word, and gesture carried significance. Success in leisure required mastery of subtlety, timing, and observation, along with the ability to navigate an intricate maze of invisible social codes. As we continue, the rules become even more bizarre. Beyond leisure, they infiltrate hygiene, health, public behavior, and even what one eats or drinks. Victorian England was a society where survival depended on knowledge, skill, and constant vigilance. The further we go, the stranger the rules become, and the more the absurdity of the era reveals itself. Darkly humorous, suffocatingly precise, and endlessly fascinating. If leisure was a tightly choreographed performance, then health and hygiene in Victorian England were nothing short of a moral crusade disguised as science. The Victorians were obsessed with cleanliness, not merely as a matter of comfort or aesthetics, but as a measure of virtue. To be dirty was to be morally suspect, to lack discipline, and to risk social condemnation. Every bodily function, every movement, and even every object in daily life was scrutinized for its potential to corrupt the body, mind, or reputation. Let's begin with the household, the epicenter of this obsession. Floors were scrubbed, walls washed, and furniture polished to gleaming perfection. Dust was treated as a moral failure, a sign of laziness, and potentially a conduit for disease. Carpets were beaten with meticulous care, windows cleaned until they sparkled, and kitchens sanitized with chemical concoctions that often had more in common with alchemy than science. The act of cleaning itself was codified. Timing, method, and frequency mattered. A host failing to maintain a spotless home risked gossip, criticism, and a subtle judgment of their moral fiber. Personal hygiene was equally regulated, though often with contradictory guidance. Daily washing was encouraged, but the methods varied wildly depending on class, gender, and perceived moral need. Women were instructed to use specific soaps, often mixed with perfumes, to cleanse their skin while avoiding excess water that might weaken their natural virtue. Men faced similar scrutiny. Scrubbing too vigorously suggested obsession or neurosis, while insufficient care implied slovenliness or moral weakness. Even hair washing was treated with ritualistic attention. Certain oils, combing techniques, and drying methods were required to maintain cleanliness without appearing improper or eccentric. Public conduct surrounding hygiene was a minefield. Spitting, for example, was a common habit in earlier centuries, but by the Victorian era, it had become socially and often legally prohibited. Streets were patrolled, and fines could be levied for improper disposal of saliva. Coughing loudly or sneezing in public required restraint, often a handkerchief pressed discreetly to the mouth, lest one be deemed coarse or careless. Toilets and privies, meanwhile, were tightly regulated, particularly for women. Public facilities were limited, creating the challenge of adhering to social propriety while meeting natural needs. Improper usage, or even suspicion of impropriety, could tarnish a reputation. Diet and food preparation were similarly laden with rules. Eating was more than sustenance. It was a demonstration of morality, intelligence, and refinement. Meals were carefully timed, with courses consumed in prescribed order. Overindulgence was a moral failing, signaling weakness of will. Eating too sparingly suggested ill health or deficiency. Even the choice of utensils was symbolic. Polished silverware demonstrated status, while worn or mismatched pieces suggested neglect or lower class. Women supervising meals were expected to guide both guests and family in proper behavior, from knife placement to soup consumption. A single breach of dining etiquette could prompt whispers that lingered long after the meal ended. Tea, the cornerstone of social interaction, was an entire universe of rules. Brewing, pouring, serving, and drinking tea required exactitude. The type of cup, the angle of the pour, and the sequence of refills all mattered. Guests were expected to observe subtle cues: when to sip, when to accept another serving, and how to comment politely on the quality. Improper handling of tea could be interpreted as ignorance, bad breeding, or a lack of respect for the host. Tea was a delicate battlefield where social competence, moral virtue, and attention to detail collided. Exercise was another regulated arena, particularly for the upper classes. Physical activity was encouraged, but it had to conform to social norms. Women were permitted walking, light gymnastics, or leisurely rides in carriages, but vigorous or noisy exercise was considered unseemly. Men could engage in more strenuous activity, but it had to be disciplined, controlled, and reflective of moral strength. Improper exertion, sweating too much, shouting, or showing visible fatigue could suggest both physical and moral weakness. Even recreational sports like croquet, tennis, or horseback riding were tightly monitored for decorum, posture, and behavior. Medical care, while evolving in this period, was also subject to social rules. Consulting a physician was a delicate matter. One had to choose the correct practitioner, follow proper introductions, and adhere to prescribed treatments with precision. Self-treatment, particularly for women, was often frowned upon, and failure to comply with medical advice could lead to moral judgments in addition to health consequences. Quack remedies abounded, and navigating the landscape of Victorian medicine required both social and intellectual skill. Mental health was similarly regulated, though often misunderstood. Emotional expression was carefully monitored, and behaviors considered abnormal could result in social ostracization or even confinement. Women were particularly vulnerable. Hysteria, nervousness, or visible emotional distress could be interpreted as moral or mental failings, sometimes resulting in long-term consequences. Men were expected to display stoicism, control, and reason at all times. The management of the mind was just as much a social obligation as the management of the body. Victorians also obsessively monitored the cleanliness and behavior of their children. From infancy, children were taught routines for washing, dressing, and personal conduct. Play was regulated to prevent moral corruption, and roughhousing was often prohibited or carefully supervised. Meals, bedtime, and study schedules were enforced with strict precision. Even outdoor play required attention to posture, movement, and social interaction, ensuring that children learned the invisible rules of propriety from the earliest possible age. Pets, too, were subject to social regulation. Dogs were expected to be leashed, cats restrained in public areas, and all animals managed in ways that reflected on their owners' morality and civility. Animal care was not simply practical, it was a public display of virtue, patience, and social responsibility. Failing to control one's pet could invite ridicule, legal trouble, or moral judgment from neighbors. The obsession with hygiene extended to clothing as well. Outer garments were washed and aired with exacting frequency, depending on fabric, class, and social expectation. Hats were cleaned, gloves polished, and shoes meticulously shined. Even minor stains or wrinkles could compromise the impression of refinement, discipline, and moral standing. Clothing was a tool of both survival and display, an outward manifestation of inner virtue. Finally, Victorian England linked health with morality in ways that might seem extreme today. A clean body suggested a disciplined mind. A dirty home suggested moral weakness. A poorly dressed individual implied both social ignorance and ethical deficiency. Disease was not merely a medical concern, it was a moral one. Public health measures, however sensible, were intertwined with judgments of character and propriety. Avoiding illness was a social imperative as much as a personal one, and failure to do so risked both physical and reputational consequences. Through all of this, the Victorians maintained a strange equilibrium. Rules were strict, contradictory, and often absurd, yet they provided structure, guidance, and a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Hygiene and health were not merely matters of survival, they were tests of moral fiber, social intelligence, and adaptability. Those who navigated these rules successfully enjoyed respect, admiration, and a place in society. Those who failed faced ridicule, ostracization, or worse. In essence, Victorian hygiene was a performance as much as a practice, a daily ritual requiring discipline, intelligence, and awareness. It was a world where morality, health, and social standing were inseparable, where even the most private acts were scrutinized for virtue or vice. To survive and to thrive, you had to understand the rules, anticipate judgment, and master the absurd logic that governed daily life. As we move forward, the rules grow stranger still. Beyond health, hygiene, and personal conduct, Victorian society dictated behavior in public, in entertainment, and even in interactions with the law. The further we explore, the more absurd, fascinating, and darkly humorous these rules reveal themselves to be. Victorian life was a theater of control, a carnival of morality, and a maze of invisible laws, and to navigate it successfully required a combination of wit, discipline, and courage. Public behavior in Victorian England was a performance that never ended. Unlike today, where a misstep in public might result in embarrassment or a social media post, in Victorian times, a breach of decorum could echo through your life, affecting reputation, family honor, and even marriage prospects. Every step, glance, and word in public spaces was measured, scrutinized, and interpreted, often with absurd precision. Streets, parks, markets, and even public transportation were arenas where morality and social hierarchy were tested continuously. Walking alone was already a complex endeavor, particularly for women. A woman strolling unaccompanied risked gossip, suspicion, or outright censure. She had to maintain proper posture, ensure her skirt remained perfectly arranged, and avoid drawing attention in any way that might suggest impropriety. Each glance over the shoulder, each tilt of the head, and each interaction with strangers was calculated, a careful negotiation of visibility and decorum. Men, meanwhile, were expected to walk with purpose and authority. Their steps conveyed social standing, confidence, and control. Too casual, and they seemed lazy or foolish. Too stiff, and they appeared unnatural or affected. In public, every movement was a statement, and the judgment of observers was swift and unrelenting. Even something as simple as using a public bench had rules. Sitting required a precise arrangement of limbs, legs crossed at the correct angle, hands resting unobtrusively, and gaze directed without lingering. A lady who fidgeted or leaned improperly could be deemed immodest, while a man who slouched or took up too much space suggested arrogance or laziness. If two people sat too close, the whispers began. Public spaces were stages for invisible judges who measured virtue, breeding, and intelligence in every gesture. Street interactions were governed by invisible codes of morality and social rank. Speaking to strangers was fraught with danger. A careless word could be misinterpreted as flirtation, insolence, or threat. Children were carefully monitored in public, taught to bow, curtsy, or remain silent as necessary. Even seemingly trivial activities like crossing the street had implicit rules. One had to yield to certain classes, avoid obstructing promenades, and behave in ways that reflected social awareness. A violation of these codes could provoke public reprimand, social gossip, or lasting embarrassment. Public transportation, which was becoming more common with the rise of trains and horse-drawn omnibuses, was another minefield. Seats were assigned socially rather than simply by availability. Women often had reserved sections, and men were expected to remain conscious of proximity, posture, and conversation. Touching, Eye contact, or even sharing space inappropriately could result in whispers, scandal, or moral censure. Conductors, fellow passengers, and onlookers all served as silent enforcers of these unwritten rules. The streets themselves had moral significance. Dirt, mud, and horse droppings were considered hazards not only to the body, but to reputation. Stepping in mud or appearing unkempt in public suggested negligence, laziness, and even moral weakness. Sidewalks were carefully navigated, and being jostled or splashed could provoke an internal crisis. Was this a personal failing or merely bad luck? The streets were a performance arena, and survival depended on maintaining composure, cleanliness, and the proper social demeanor under any circumstance. Markets and shops were similarly governed by complex social rules. Haggling was acceptable, but it had to be executed with finesse. A woman attempting to negotiate aggressively could be deemed immodest, while a man showing ignorance or impatience might appear foolish or uncultured. The choice of goods, the manner of questioning, and the tone of voice were all critical. Shopkeepers themselves were expected to observe proper manners, balancing business acumen with deference to social hierarchy. Every transaction was a dance, with potential judgment looming over every exchange. Even public displays of emotion were carefully monitored. Crying in the street, shouting, or laughing too loudly could provoke moral condemnation. Women, in particular, were expected to control visible feelings, maintaining an appearance of composure and restraint. Men, though freer in expression, were still expected to exhibit self-control and respectability. Public emotion was a sign not of humanity, but of discipline, or lack thereof. The failure to regulate one's expression could signal moral weakness, low breeding, or intellectual inferiority. Public gatherings like fairs, parades, or exhibitions were miniature arenas of judgment. Attendance implied status, and behavior was constantly scrutinized. People observed how one navigated crowds, interacted with strangers, and engaged in spectacle. Even seemingly trivial actions, laughing at the wrong moment, glancing inappropriately, or standing in the wrong spot, could lead to social censure. The crowd itself acted as an informal tribunal, enforcing the invisible codes of morality and decorum. Street vendors, performers, and beggars were all caught in the web of Victorian rules. Begging was technically legal, but interacting with a beggar could be seen as charitable, condescending, or morally corrupt, depending on execution. Street performers had to conform to expectations of propriety, avoiding gestures or behaviors that might be deemed vulgar. The streets were a theater where everyone, from elite to indigent, performed a social role under constant observation. Rules extended even to gestures and eye contact. Meeting a stranger's gaze could imply confidence, curiosity, flirtation, or insolence. Avoiding the gaze entirely could suggest fear, shame, or ill breeding. Bowing, curtsying, or tipping the hat was not merely politeness. It was a moral and social statement, reflecting awareness of hierarchy, respect, and virtue. Miscalculating these interactions could lead to public embarrassment or private gossip, which in a tightly knit Victorian community could last a lifetime. Even minor infractions were remembered. Spitting, coughing, or sneezing without proper discretion could provoke moral disapproval. Walking on the wrong side of the street, speaking out of turn, or wearing slightly improper attire could invite gossip. Public behavior was a constant test, a measure of intelligence, breeding, and moral standing. The streets were alive with invisible eyes, and survival required careful attention, discipline, and subtlety. Paradoxically, this obsession with public propriety created opportunities for subtle rebellion and dark humor. People learned to bend rules without breaking them, to signal wit, intelligence, or eccentricity while maintaining an outward facade of virtue. Clever gestures, carefully timed expressions, or private jokes became tools of survival and amusement. Victorian life, in public as in private, was a theater of morality, absurdity, and creativity, requiring constant vigilance, adaptability, and humor. By mastering public behavior, Victorians maintained their social standing, avoided gossip, and preserved family honor. It was a skill as vital as reading, writing, or dress. One misstep could ripple through social circles, influencing marriage prospects, business relationships, and personal reputation. In essence, public life was a game of constant calculation, with morality, decorum, and observation as both rules and weapons. And yet, despite the rigidity, the absurdity of these rules created a secret playground for wit, creativity, and subtle rebellion. Public scrutiny forced individuals to innovate, improvise, and perform with skill. Those who succeeded earned admiration. Those who failed became cautionary tales. The streets of Victorian England were not merely passages from point A to point B. They were stages of judgment, performance, and survival. As we move deeper into Victorian life, the rules become stranger still. From leisure and public behavior, we will soon venture into the bizarre regulations surrounding children, education, and even the treatment of the sick and elderly. Victorian society's obsession with control, morality, and social hierarchy left no aspect of life untouched. The further we go, the more surreal and darkly humorous these rules become, an intricate, suffocating, yet endlessly fascinating web of human behavior. Children in Victorian England were not simply young humans learning to exist in the world. They were miniature moral experiments, constantly observed, instructed, and corrected to ensure they conformed to society's stringent expectations. Childhood was a stage in which discipline, decorum, and obedience were instilled with relentless precision. Play, education, and even sleep were regulated to prevent the corruption of body, mind, or, heaven forbid, moral character. From the moment a child was born, Victorian parents were obsessed with controlling environment, behavior, and routine. Infants were swaddled in tightly bound cloths, a practice believed to strengthen virtue and promote proper posture. Cribs, bedding, and clothing were selected with almost ritualistic care. Fabrics had to be clean, of proper weight, and often perfumed, and even minor stains or wrinkling could provoke worry or social judgment. Feeding was a precise affair. The right timing, the proper quantity, and the correct temperature were all monitored. Bottles and utensils were sterilized according to the latest medical advice, or what passed for medical advice at the time, because the moral and physical corruption of a child was feared almost as much as disease itself. As children grew, education became both a moral and social project. Schools were not just places of learning, they were laboratories for instilling discipline, obedience, and class consciousness. Boys and girls were segregated, not merely for propriety, but to ensure that moral corruption, inappropriate behavior, and premature exposure to desire were minimized. In classrooms, every movement was observed. Sitting posture, hand placement, tone of voice, and even facial expressions were evaluated. Teachers, often stern and unforgiving, acted as moral enforcers as much as educators. Mistakes in arithmetic or grammar were less dangerous than mistakes in etiquette, which could have lasting social consequences. Play was tolerated, but it was also regulated. Outdoor games were acceptable only if conducted with proper decorum. Boys might engage in cricket, tennis, or croquet, but aggression, shouting, or roughhousing was frowned upon. Girls were expected to partake in more subdued activities, sewing, drawing, reading, or gentle walks. Even imaginative play was watched carefully. Fantasy could be harmless, but excess imagination or inappropriate mimicry of adult behaviors might be interpreted as moral or intellectual weakness. Toys themselves were moral instruments. Dolls, miniature houses, and model furniture taught lessons in propriety, domestic order, and hierarchy. A mismanaged dollhouse could signal a lack of moral education, or so the Victorians believed. Discipline was a central pillar of Victorian childhood. Corporal punishment was widespread, justified as a tool to correct moral failings and instill obedience. Parents and teachers wielded canes, belts, and rulers with ritualistic consistency. The child's reaction was as important as the punishment itself. Tears or complaints had to be contained. Humility and submission were expected virtues. Resistance was not merely misbehavior, it was a threat to social order. In some cases, children were sent to boarding schools to further enforce discipline, subjected to regimes so strict that even minor infractions could lead to isolation, deprivation, or humiliation. Even clothing was part of moral instruction. Boys were dressed to reflect strength, propriety, and discipline, while girls were clothed to promote modesty, virtue, and delicacy. Corsets, starched collars, and tight-fitting garments were considered essential for teaching children control over their bodies, posture, and social presentation. Shoes, gloves, and hats were not optional. They were moral statements. Mismanaged attire could invite criticism, gossip, or the dreaded whispering about parental inadequacy. Meals were another arena of moral regulation. Children were expected to consume food politely, at the proper pace, with attention to cutlery placement and posture. Overeating was a sign of gluttony. Undereating suggested weakness or illness. Table manners were drilled from infancy, and public observation ensured compliance. Mealtime was both a moral exercise and a social rehearsal, preparing children for the public scrutiny they would face throughout life. Visiting etiquette extended even to playdates. Children were expected to behave with decorum in others' homes, following invisible codes of interaction. Greetings, farewells, conversation, and even attention to shared toys were governed by rules designed to prevent impertinence and promote moral training. Hosts were expected to provide a controlled environment, ensuring that each child's behavior reflected proper upbringing. Improper conduct, like shouting, grabbing, or mispronouncing words, could be remembered and reported, affecting social connections for years. Letters and correspondence were also part of a child's moral education. Writing was taught not only as literacy, but as a tool for social signaling. Children learned to write thank you notes, apology letters, and polite requests with precision. Punctuation, tone, and phrasing were carefully monitored. A misstep in a single word could be seen as ignorance, impoliteness, or moral deficiency. Proper letter writing was essential to proving one's breeding, intellect, and social awareness. Hygiene in children was a matter of both health and morality. Baths, teeth brushing, and hair washing were mandatory and carefully timed. Children were taught that dirt was not only unsightly, but morally dangerous. Hair had to be neatly combed, nails trimmed, and skin cleaned with particular soaps and ointments. Neglect in this area reflected directly on parental competence and a child's virtue, making cleanliness an imperative for survival in social circles. Sleep was another controlled domain. Bedtimes were strict, lights extinguished at precise hours, and nighttime behaviors monitored. Children who woke during the night were expected to remain quiet, for loud cries were interpreted as moral weakness or lack of discipline. Bedrooms were arranged to reinforce order, furniture in prescribed positions, bedding neat, and belongings carefully stored. Even nightwear was chosen to reflect propriety and social standing. Education extended beyond the classroom. Moral and religious instruction permeated every activity, from reading the Bible to memorizing poetry. Stories of virtue, heroism, and obedience reinforced societal expectations. Misbehavior was punished not just for practical reasons, but because it threatened the moral fabric of the child's character. Imagination, curiosity, and questioning were encouraged only within narrow limits. Too much curiosity might lead to dissent. Too little suggested dullness or intellectual deficiency. Children were also taught about gender-specific rules early. Boys learned about courage, authority, and responsibility, while girls were trained in modesty, obedience, and domestic management. These lessons extended into play, chores, and social interaction. Even small gestures, a curtsy, the way a boy held a door, or how a girl folded her hands, were rehearsed to perfection. Deviation was remembered, judged, and corrected with relentless precision. Punishment, play, education, and socialization combined to make Victorian childhood an exhausting performance. Survival required constant attention to rules, observation of others, and suppression of impulsive behavior. Despite this, children found ways to navigate the absurdities of these expectations. Secret games, whispered jokes, and small acts of rebellion provided relief, amusement, and subtle social training in cunning and observation. Victorian childhood was not merely a stage for growth. It was a moral laboratory, a controlled environment designed to produce disciplined, socially aware adults. Every action, from feeding to walking, sleeping to playing, was subject to scrutiny. Success meant survival in a world obsessed with appearances, virtue, and order. Failure could have consequences that lasted a lifetime. By understanding these rules, we see the intensity of Victorian obsession with control, morality, and propriety. Children were trained not just in practical skills, but in the invisible codes that governed adult life. They learned to navigate hierarchy, anticipate judgment, and perform with intelligence, grace, and subtlety. The absurdity of the regulations created opportunities for wit, rebellion, and humor, but the stakes were never small. Survival and social success depended on mastery of the rules from the earliest possible age. As we continue, we will see how these rules extended into education, fashion, and even the bizarre ways Victorians dealt with illness, aging, and death. childhood was only the beginning, and the deeper we go, the stranger, more oppressive, and darkly humorous the rules become. Victorian life was a web of invisible laws, and navigating it required wit, discipline, and courage from cradle to grave. Education in Victorian England was less about learning and more about molding citizens who could navigate the labyrinthine rules of society. Schools were both classrooms and miniature social theaters where behavior, posture, morality, and obedience were monitored alongside arithmetic and reading. Knowledge alone was insufficient. How one carried oneself, how one spoke, and even how one thought were under constant scrutiny. In essence, Victorian education was a moral and social training camp disguised as an academic institution. For boys, schools were often harsh environments designed to cultivate discipline, resilience, and hierarchy awareness. Corporal punishment was routine, sometimes brutal, but always presented as moral instruction. Mistakes in arithmetic were forgiven, but lapses in decorum, slouching, muttering, or failing to address a teacher properly were met with swift retribution. The goal was to produce young men who could survive, respect, and navigate the rigid hierarchies of Victorian society. Girls' education, on the other hand, focused heavily on propriety, domestic skills, and social grace. Academic subjects were taught, but the emphasis was often on presentation and memorization rather than critical thinking. Needlework, drawing, music, and proper speech were considered as important, if not more so, than reading or mathematics. The underlying principle was that young women must be socially competent, attractive, and morally unassailable. Failure to master these skills could jeopardize marriage prospects, social standing, and even the perception of one's family. Attendance at school was itself a moral test. Being late, absent without sufficient cause, or even speaking out of turn was considered evidence of moral laxity or improper upbringing. Parents were judged alongside their children. A misbehaving student reflected poorly on the household, suggesting negligence, poor discipline, or worse. Victorian society held families accountable for their children's adherence to social norms, making education a shared responsibility and a constant source of anxiety. Discipline in schools extended beyond mere obedience. Posture, hand placement, and even facial expression were closely monitored. Students were expected to sit upright, hands folded neatly, eyes down when required, and maintain a calm, attentive demeanor. Any deviation, leaning back, fidgeting, or smiling at the wrong moment, could result in correction, shame, or public reprimand. The aim was to train children in self-control, poise, and the subtle signals of propriety that would govern adult social interactions. Extracurricular activities, surprisingly, were as regulated as the classroom. Sports for boys were a test of physical prowess, teamwork, and adherence to rules, but also of social hierarchy and moral character. Girls' recreational activities were gentler, often focusing on dance, music, or needlework, but still closely monitored for grace, discipline, and decorum. Play was tolerated only if it reinforced, rather than threatened, social and moral norms. A competitive streak in a boy might be applauded if it demonstrated strategic thinking, but frowned upon if it led to cruelty or disobedience. A girl's performance in a dance recital was judged not only for technical skill, but for elegance, modesty, and charm. Even lessons in literature and history were infused with morality. Texts were carefully selected to teach virtue, patriotism, and proper social behavior. Stories of heroism, piety, and obedience were emphasized, while narratives containing subversive ideas, romance, or rebellion were strictly controlled or excluded. Students were expected to internalize the moral of each story, demonstrating not only comprehension, but the ability to reflect appropriate social lessons in their behavior. Misinterpreting a text or failing to express the correct moral understanding could be a source of reprimand or ridicule. Exams and assessments were another theater of performance. Success was not only measured by knowledge, but by conduct during examination. Posture, attentiveness, and even the choice of pen or pencil could signal social awareness and discipline. Cheating was, of course, forbidden, but even subtle behaviors, sighing too loudly, fidgeting, or whispering, were considered indicators of improper upbringing. Victorian assessment was as much about judging character as intellect. Social interaction in schools was a highly structured affair. Seating arrangements were deliberate, separating students by class, gender, and social expectation. Conversations were monitored. Friendships were not only personal, but social statements. Children learned early that aligning with the wrong peer could be damaging, while associating with the right group could confer status, protection, and moral approval. Gossip, alliances, and social observation became survival skills long before adolescence. Uniforms were a literal symbol of conformity. Boys' and girls' clothing had to be immaculate, signaling discipline, class, and adherence to rules. Buttons polished, collars straight, shoes shined. The smallest lapse could invite criticism. Uniforms were a constant reminder that the individual existed not solely as a person, but as a representation of family, class, and moral standing. Proper presentation was non-negotiable. Teachers themselves were instruments of the invisible social hierarchy. They enforced rules with a mix of authority and moral instruction, ensuring that each child understood not only academic material, but how to survive socially. A teacher's correction was as much a lesson in morality as in mathematics or spelling. Subtle reprimands, public correction, and private admonishment reinforced the notion that every action carried consequence. A student learned quickly that ignorance might be forgivable, but impropriety was not. Punishment systems were elaborate and ritualized. Corporal punishment, isolation, or public humiliation were carefully calibrated to correct behavior without completely destroying a child's social viability. The objective was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but the creation of disciplined, morally aware citizens. Children internalize these lessons, learning to regulate behavior not only in school, but in all aspects of life, anticipating judgment from teachers, peers, and the broader society. Victorian schools also imposed strict schedules. Every hour of the day was regulated. Study, meals, recreation, and rest. Free time was almost non-existent. Idleness was considered morally dangerous. Students learned early to plan, execute, and regulate their own behavior according to imposed standards. Efficiency, discipline, and adherence to routine were prized as indicators of moral and intellectual competence. Religion permeated education as well. Prayers, Bible study, and moral instruction were daily fixtures. Children learned to internalize virtue, obedience, and piety alongside literacy and numeracy. Religious observance was both moral training and social signaling. Proper recitation, attention, and posture during religious instruction were scrutinized. Failing to perform correctly could suggest moral deficiency or negligence. The absurdity of Victorian educational rules often created opportunities for subversion, humor, and subtle rebellion. Children found ways to express individuality without violating outward appearances. Secret notes, whispered jokes, and small acts of defiance became tools of both survival and amusement. In a world where every movement, word, and glance was judged, clever improvisation became an essential skill. Ultimately, Victorian education was less about imparting knowledge than about producing socially adept, morally disciplined adults. Every interaction, lesson, and action was imbued with significance. Success meant survival and social advancement. Failure could have lasting consequences for both the child and their family. Education was a crucible, forging individuals capable of navigating the endless, intricate rules of Victorian life. By understanding the rigid, sometimes absurd codes enforced in schools, we glimpse the intensity of societal control. Children were trained from a young age to anticipate judgment, adhere to rules, and perform morality, poise, and intelligence constantly. These lessons extended far beyond the classroom, shaping every interaction, gesture, and decision in adulthood. Victorian life demanded mastery of both visible and invisible rules, and education was the first arena in which these skills were honed. As we move forward, we will explore how fashion, illness, aging, and even death were governed by equally elaborate rules. Education may have been the training ground, but Victorian society's obsession with control did not end there. The deeper we delve, the stranger, darker, and more humorously absurd these regulations become. Survival required intelligence, discipline, and, above all, the ability to navigate a world governed by invisible codes that touched every facet of life. Fashion in Victorian England was more than clothing. It was a statement of morality, class, and social mastery. A dress or suit was not simply something to keep the body warm or cover it from view. It was a rigidly codified declaration of virtue, propriety, and understanding of the social order. Every garment, accessory, and color choice carried meaning, and missteps could have consequences reaching far beyond embarrassment. For women, fashion was a tightrope of beauty, modesty, and social signaling. Corsets were perhaps the most infamous instrument of control. They compressed the waist, shaped posture, and, crucially, signaled discipline. A tightly laced corset suggested self-control, virtue, and elegance. A poorly fitted one implied sloppiness, indulgence, or moral weakness. Yet corsets were also physically torturous, causing fainting, bruising, and, in extreme cases, internal harm. Victorians accepted these dangers as necessary. The social cost of appearing unshaped far outweighed the discomfort. Skirts and petticoats were equally regulated. Length, fullness, and even the angle of folds conveyed social information. Too short, and a woman was immodest. Too long, and she risked appearing ungainly or out of touch. Fabrics had to be clean, pressed, and carefully layered. Patterns were chosen with care. Subtlety suggested taste, while ostentation could imply vulgarity or pretension. Colors carried moral and social significance, with certain shades reserved for specific occasions, social classes, or ages. A misjudged color could inspire whispers that echoed across social gatherings. Accessories were moral instruments as much as decorative ones. Gloves, fans, hats, and jewelry all conveyed discipline, taste, and propriety. Gloves were particularly important. Bare hands were acceptable only in private or among family. A misplaced glove could signal inattentiveness, ignorance of etiquette, or even a lapse in morality. Fans were used not only to cool oneself, but to convey coded messages. Subtle flicks, positions, and movements communicated consent, refusal, or flirtation, all while maintaining the appearance of decorum. Hats indicated class, marital status, and age, and their removal or placement was a ritualized act of social awareness. Men's fashion, while less restrictive physically, was equally fraught with social significance. Tailcoats, waistcoats, and trousers were not merely garments, but badges of moral and social discipline. Clothing had to be immaculate, properly fitted, and appropriate for time, place, and company. Accessories such as canes, gloves, and hats were carefully chosen to signal taste, authority, and awareness of hierarchy. Even facial hair carried meaning. A neatly groomed beard or mustache could suggest wisdom, refinement, or virility, while a careless shave might indicate sloth or disregard for propriety. Footwear, for both men and women, was another source of obsession. Shoes had to be polished, heels straight, and laces perfectly tied. Dirty, scuffed, or ill-fitting shoes were more than a minor aesthetic problem. They were read as moral failure, a lack of discipline, or ignorance of social expectation. In public, walking with care was not only a measure of grace, but also a display of proper upbringing, as shoes were constantly on view. Even intimate apparel was governed by rules, though quietly so. Proper undergarments were essential for shaping posture, modesty, and public appearance. Petticoats, corsets, and chemises created the silhouette expected in polite society, reinforcing the moral and aesthetic values of the era. For men, underclothing was simpler but still important, reflecting hygiene, discipline, and financial stability. Missteps in undergarment choice could have reputational consequences, especially among those who prided themselves on observing subtle indicators of class and propriety. Seasonal and situational fashion rules were equally strict. Certain fabrics, colors, and accessories were designated for mourning, formal occasions, casual visits, or public appearances. Wearing the wrong ensemble could imply ignorance, insensitivity, or worse, moral failing. Women, in particular, had to master an entire wardrobe of seasonal rules, understanding which materials, hues, and trims were appropriate at any given time. A misstep could result in social whispers or exclusion, marking a woman as careless or improper. Children's fashion was no less regulated. Boys and girls were dressed to reflect virtue, modesty, and social awareness. Boys often wore miniature versions of adult clothing, emphasizing posture, discipline, and conformity, while girls were dressed to project delicacy, propriety, and refinement. Clothing reinforced social hierarchy, gender roles, and moral training from an early age, teaching children that their outward appearance was inseparable from their social and moral standing. Accessories extended even to seemingly trivial items like handkerchiefs, jewelry, and ribbons. Handkerchiefs were moral instruments, used not only for hygiene, but as a signal of decorum. Jewelry indicated class, wealth, and breeding. Ribbons conveyed both fashion sense and personal restraint. Even the absence of these items could be interpreted as a moral or social failing. Every detail mattered, and every choice was scrutinized by both peers and society at large. Weddings and formal events were fashion spectacles laden with moral significance. Brides wore white to symbolize purity, modesty, and virtue, while grooms displayed taste, status, and authority through carefully chosen attire. Guests were also bound by rules. Improper clothing could overshadow the couple, suggest ignorance, or indicate disrespect. Social missteps in dress at these events were remembered and whispered about for years, illustrating the extraordinary power of fashion as a social regulator. Fashion rules extended to personal grooming as well. Hair, nails, and skin were constantly observed. Women were expected to maintain elaborate hairstyles, often using pins, oils, and combing techniques that required daily attention. Men were expected to maintain beards, mustaches, or clean-shaven faces according to current trends and social expectation. Even minor lapses, split ends, smudged makeup, or uneven shaving could reflect poorly on discipline, moral character, or attention to social obligation. Travel imposed additional fashion challenges. Hats and gloves were necessary for outdoor travel, while specific attire was expected for carriages, trains, or walks. The ability to adapt clothing to circumstances reflected not only practicality, but also social awareness. Improper dress during travel could provoke judgment from fellow passengers, conductors, or even strangers, as society's eyes were never idle. Fashion, ultimately, was a moral battlefield. Each article of clothing, accessory, and grooming choice reflected a complex set of invisible rules. Success required awareness, discipline, and the ability to navigate both explicit and subtle social expectations. Failure could provoke gossip, moral judgment, and social exclusion. The stakes were high. Appearance was morality, and morality was survival in a society obsessed with perception. Yet, beneath the rigid layers, there was room for creativity, wit, and subtle rebellion. Women learned to manipulate fashion to signal personality, flirtation, or intelligence while maintaining propriety. Men found ways to express individuality through accessories, tailoring, and minor deviations from the norm. Fashion became both a trap and a playground, a tool of control and a subtle instrument of personal expression. Victorian clothing was thus inseparable from life itself. It reflected status, virtue, and morality, dictating how one was perceived and treated. Those who mastered these rules navigated society with grace, influence, and subtle power. Those who failed risked ridicule, exclusion, and the slow erosion of reputation. Fashion was not superficial. It was survival, a constant, visible testament to discipline, intelligence, and social skill. As we continue, the strange, suffocating rules of Victorian life will infiltrate health, illness, aging, and death. Fashion is just one layer of this meticulous, absurdly regulated world. The further we go, the stranger and darker the rules become, exposing a society where morality, perception, and survival were inseparable from the most minute details of daily life. Health in Victorian England was an obsession wrapped in morality, superstition, and an emerging science that often contradicted itself. Victorians believed that the state of the body reflected the state of the soul. Illness was not merely a biological condition, It was a signal of moral weakness, poor discipline, or negligence. Those who failed to maintain their health risked more than fever or consumption. They risked social censure, whispered gossip, and the subtle judgment of every neighbor, relative, and passerby. One of the most glaring contradictions of Victorian medicine was the simultaneous obsession with cleanliness and the fear of overexposure to water. Baths were prescribed regularly, yet overbathing was thought to weaken the constitution, particularly for women. The balance was precarious. Too little bathing suggested sloth or immorality. Too much implied obsession, nervousness, or hysteria. Women were instructed to use perfumed cloths, gentle soaps, and specific oils to cleanse themselves, maintaining both health and virtue. Men were advised similar regimes, though they enjoyed slightly more leeway. Still, appearance and scent were scrutinized as measures of discipline and social standing. Food and diet were equally fraught with regulation. Meals were not simply sustenance, they were moral exercises. Overeating indicated gluttony, weakness, or lack of control. Undereating suggested fragility or ill health. Certain foods were considered virtuous or corrupting. Vegetables and simple meats were praised for strengthening the body and mind, while rich sauces, pastries, and exotic imports were feared for encouraging indulgence, laziness, and moral decay. Cooking itself was a moral performance. Every dish had to be prepared with care, timing, and decorum. Burnt edges, sour milk, or improperly spiced food reflected poorly not only on the cook, but on the household's moral discipline. Physical activity was another battleground of morality. Exercise was encouraged, but not indiscriminately. Women were allowed walking, light riding, and gentle gymnastics, provided they maintained grace and decorum. Men could participate in more vigorous pursuits, yet public displays of overexertion or fatigue were frowned upon. Sweating excessively was a sign of uncontrolled passion or poor constitution. Proper exercise required discipline, measured effort, and careful adherence to social expectation. Doctors were both revered and feared. Consulting a physician was a social ritual fraught with expectation. Choosing the right doctor, following their instructions, and adhering to prescribed remedies was a moral duty as much as a medical necessity. Self-treatment, particularly for women, was suspect, hinting at ignorance, imprudence, or irresponsibility. Quack remedies flourished, exploiting the tension between desperation and propriety. Patients learned quickly that illness was not only a physical burden, but a moral and social one. Failure to follow medical guidance could provoke whispers, subtle exclusion, or overt criticism. Mental health was even more treacherous terrain. Emotional imbalance, anxiety, or nervousness could be interpreted as moral weakness or a sign of defective upbringing. Women were particularly vulnerable. Hysteria, a condition widely diagnosed at the time, was treated as both a medical and moral failing. Treatments were strange by modern standards, ranging from rest cures to confinement. Men were expected to suppress emotional displays, masking stress or grief under stoicism. Public acknowledgement of mental strain was risky. Propriety demanded composure, self-control, and discipline at all times. Children's health was under constant surveillance. From infancy, diets, hygiene, and activity were strictly regulated. Play was permitted only if it did not risk injury, moral corruption, or exposure to unhealthy influences. Illness in a child was not merely a medical concern, it suggested parental negligence or poor moral guidance. Childhood fevers, rashes, or digestive issues were treated with a mixture of fear, superstition, and rigorous discipline, and parents were held accountable for each perceived lapse. Illness itself was heavily moralized. Diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, or smallpox carried social as well as physical consequences. Victims were often shunned, blamed, or pitied in ways that reflected their supposed moral failings. Cleanliness, moral discipline, and proper diet were touted as defenses against disease. Those who contracted illness were scrutinized. Did they neglect hygiene, overindulge in food, or fail to adhere to medical guidance? Health was not simply personal, it was a public reflection of virtue. Quarantine and isolation were not just medical necessities, they were moral imperatives. Those suffering from contagious disease were segregated, their movement restricted, and their behavior monitored. Visitors were limited, and families faced public scrutiny. Even recovery carried social weight. Returning to society after illness required proof of restored virtue, discipline, and cleanliness. The invisible gaze of neighbors and acquaintances was ever present, enforcing compliance with the moral codes embedded in health practices. The treatment of chronic illness or aging was equally regimented. Elderly individuals were expected to maintain decorum, manage their ailments with patience, and refrain from public complaint. Diseases associated with age, arthritis, dementia, or weakness were tolerated only insofar as the individual maintained dignity, modesty, and adherence to social expectation. Dependency was a moral concern. Reliance on others could be read as weakness or indulgence. Families monitored the health and behavior of elders carefully, balancing care with societal expectation. Hospitals, which were becoming more common, were both sanctuaries and stages of judgment. Patients were expected to comply with strict routines, adhere to schedules, and accept treatment with humility. Deviations were punished through moral judgment as much as medical intervention. Visitors observed conduct, cleanliness, and demeanor, reinforcing the social significance of health. Even in the supposedly private realm of convalescence, one's moral and social performance was never fully unobserved. Public health campaigns, while practical, were often infused with moral undertones. Soap advertisements, hygiene posters, and instructional pamphlets combined science with virtue, warning that neglect endangered both body and soul. Cholera epidemics, for example, were framed not only as medical crises, but as moral lessons. Cleanliness, order, and disciplined living were positioned as defenses against social and bodily corruption. Following these instructions was a civic as well as personal duty. The absurdity of Victorian health rules created both compliance and rebellion. People found subtle ways to enjoy food, exercise, or leisure without breaching moral expectations. Secret indulgences, clever avoidance of scrutiny, and private routines allowed individuals to navigate a world obsessed with control while preserving personal comfort and sanity. Humor, ingenuity, and discretion became essential survival skills, as health, morality, and social perception were inextricably intertwined. Victorian obsession with health was thus more than an interest in longevity. It was a theater of morality. Proper diet, hygiene, exercise, and compliance with medical guidance were essential for survival, social standing, and reputation. Every action had significance, and failure carried consequences beyond the physical realm. Health was not simply biological, it was a moral and social performance, one that demanded vigilance, intelligence, and subtlety at every turn. As we continue, the Victorian obsession with control extends into aging, death, and the bizarre rituals surrounding the end of life. If health was a stage, mortality was the grandest performance, replete with rules, rituals, and the same suffocating blend of morality, propriety, and absurdity. Survival in Victorian England required mastering not only life, but the moral choreography of living, and eventually dying. Aging in Victorian England was not a quiet, private affair. Every wrinkle, stoop, and gray hair was read as a moral and social statement. Old age was less a natural progression and more a test of discipline, decorum, and the ability to perform virtue under increasing physical and social constraints. Victorians treated the elderly as both venerable and vulnerable, imposing rules that reflected their obsessive concern with order, morality, and appearance. Appearance was paramount. An older person's clothing had to reflect dignity, propriety, and social rank. Men wore carefully tailored coats, waistcoats, and hats that signaled authority, experience, and self-discipline. Women's dresses were expected to convey modesty, refinement, and decorum, often limiting color and extravagance. Accessories, gloves, shawls, walking sticks were not mere embellishments, they were instruments of social signaling. Mismanaged attire could be interpreted as moral laziness, financial irresponsibility, or neglect of family duty. Physical behavior was similarly regulated. Elderly individuals were expected to maintain posture, composure, and controlled movement. Slouching, loud speech, or unsteady gait were considered signs of moral weakness or poor upbringing. Walking in public required careful attention to timing, distance, and interaction with others. Even simple acts like crossing a street, attending a market, or visiting neighbors were opportunities for judgment. The elderly were watched, measured, and evaluated constantly, their every motion a reflection of virtue or deficiency. Social interaction carried layers of expectation. Older individuals were supposed to display wisdom, restraint, and moral authority. Interruptions, complaints, or immoderate laughter were frowned upon. Conversation was a delicate art. Excessive talk implied frivolity or senility. Silence suggested withdrawal or disengagement. Family members, neighbors, and acquaintances all monitored the elderly's behavior, reinforcing the subtle hierarchy in which the old were respected, but only if they performed age with decorum. Work, leisure, and domestic duties were also prescribed with moral precision. Retired men were expected to advise, supervise, or mentor younger relatives, demonstrating experience and leadership. Women, particularly widows, were expected to maintain households, oversee servants, or engage in charitable activity, all while upholding moral standards. Idleness was dangerous. Too much rest implied laziness, indulgence, or moral decay. The elderly were encouraged to be productive, useful, and socially visible, yet never to overstep the bounds of propriety. Health in old age was scrutinized with near religious intensity. The elderly were advised on diet, hygiene, and exercise, with the same obsessive care applied to children. Overeating, excessive indulgence, or neglect of bodily care was read as evidence of moral weakness. Fainting, coughing, or other ailments were sometimes treated less as medical conditions and more as signs of poor self-discipline or spiritual deficiency. Chronic illness required delicate management. Patients were expected to comply with doctors, maintain hygiene, and demonstrate stoicism, all while avoiding behaviors that might provoke judgment or gossip. Family relations were another sphere of complex expectation. Elderly individuals were both revered and surveilled by their descendants. Obedience, patience, and the careful management of emotions were required to maintain social and familial harmony. Anger, impatience, or excessive complaint could be interpreted as selfishness, a failure of moral development, or a disruption to household order. Even minor disagreements could ripple through social circles, leading to whispered judgments or long-lasting reputational consequences. Public exposure of the elderly was tightly regulated. Society expected decorum in public appearances, whether attending church, visiting friends, or walking in parks. Slouching, loud speech, or improper attire could provoke subtle or overt censure. The elderly were also expected to navigate public spaces without inconvenience or offense to others, demonstrating awareness, respect, and moral discipline. Failure to adhere to these standards could result in whispers, ridicule, or social isolation. Charity and social engagement were moral obligations. Elderly individuals, particularly women, were expected to participate in charitable work, church activities, and social mentorship. Volunteering, hosting tea parties, or supervising younger family members was a way to maintain relevance and display virtue. Refusal or inability to participate could be read as moral failing, laziness, or detachment from social responsibility. Social activity was not optional. It was a performance of continued usefulness and moral fitness. Mourning, a lifelong expectation for some, extended into old age. Widows and widowers were expected to adhere to strict rules of dress, behavior, and public demeanor following the death of a spouse. Black clothing, minimal adornment, and a subdued presence were required for years in some cases. Mourning was a moral exercise, demonstrating fidelity, patience, and emotional restraint. Improper grief, too expressive, too brief, or too lavishly displayed, was criticized and remembered by society. Aging also carried financial expectations. The elderly were expected to manage their resources prudently, avoiding extravagance or waste. Poverty could be morally judged. Those unable to maintain appearances risked gossip and social stigma. Wealthy elders, meanwhile, were expected to use their resources to support family, community, and charity. Mismanagement of funds, poor generosity, or conspicuous consumption could provoke censure and threaten social standing. Death loomed as the ultimate stage for Victorian rules. The elderly were expected to prepare for death with grace, ensuring that wills, funerals, and moral legacies were in order. The process of dying was regulated by social expectation. Composure, silence, and preparation were signs of moral and social mastery. Public displays of fear, impatience, or complaint were discouraged, as they disrupted the moral order and reflected poorly on the family. Even the choice of burial clothes, coffin, and funeral arrangements was subject to societal scrutiny. Hospitals, asylums, and care homes were extensions of these expectations. The elderly were expected to obey schedules, maintain cleanliness, and adhere to routines. Deviations, Complaints, resistance, or improper behavior were often treated as moral failings as much as medical issues. Observers, staff, and family members all acted as moral auditors, ensuring that the aging individual continued to perform virtue, discipline, and propriety until the very end. The absurdity of these rules often led to subtle rebellion and humor. Elderly individuals found ways to exercise autonomy within the constraints imposed by society. Private indulgences, whispered jokes, and small acts of defiance became essential tools for maintaining dignity, sanity, and personality. Yet even these small rebellions were framed by the ever-present demand to appear virtuous, disciplined, and composed. Aging in Victorian England was therefore a constant performance. Every wrinkle, gesture, and word was scrutinized as a reflection of character, discipline, and social awareness. Survival in old age required mastery of both physical and moral rules, a careful balancing act between personal comfort and societal expectation. Success brought respect, influence, and continued participation in social life. Failure brought gossip, exclusion, and shame. By examining the rules governing aging, we see the Victorian obsession with control, morality, and social perception extend to every stage of life. Youth, adulthood, and now old age were all subject to the same intricate system of judgment. These regulations created a society where morality, appearance, and behavior were inseparable from survival, and where even the final years of life were infused with expectation, discipline, and absurdity. As we move toward death, Victorian rules become at once more surreal, solemn, and darkly humorous. Mortality, like youth, appearance, and health, was a stage upon which morality, decorum, and social performance were measured. The next chapter will take us into the macabre, ritualized, and surprisingly strict rules governing death itself, an ultimate test of virtue, composure, and societal mastery. Death in Victorian England was far from a private affair. It was a social performance, a moral test, and a theater of etiquette observed by family, neighbors, and the wider community. The dying were expected to demonstrate composure, acceptance, and discipline, while the living were obligated to display grief, respect, and proper ritual. The rules surrounding death were as intricate, strange, and suffocating as those governing life itself. Preparation for death began long before the final moments. Wealthy households maintained elaborate instructions for funerals, burial clothes, and postmus arrangements. Coffins had to be correctly proportioned, lined with particular fabrics, and sealed with precision. Embalming, when employed, was carefully monitored to ensure that the body remained dignified and presentable for viewing. Even for poorer families, funerals demanded attention to societal norms. The deceased had to be treated with proper ritual, clothing, and ceremony. Negligence or impropriety reflected poorly on the family, suggesting moral laxity or ignorance. Mourning attire was a critical part of death etiquette. Widows were expected to wear black for years following a husband's passing, often abstaining from color, jewelry, or frivolous activity for as long as society deemed appropriate. The length and strictness of mourning dress depended on social class, but the underlying principle was constant. Outward appearance reflected inner virtue. Any deviation could be interpreted as disrespect, insensitivity, or moral failure. Widowers also adhered to rules, though less rigidly, signaling restraint, dignity, and acknowledgement of loss through somber dress and demeanor. Visitation rules were labyrinthine. Guests attending a deathbed, funeral, or wake had to observe strict etiquette. Conversation was limited to expressions of condolence and grief. Laughter, jokes, or personal anecdotes were considered inappropriate. Gestures were scrutinized. A bow too low, a hand held too firmly, or an overly sympathetic glance could miscommunicate feelings, suggesting intimacy, disdain, or moral failure. Those visiting the bereaved were judged as carefully as the mourners themselves. The preparation of the body was a meticulous, highly moralized process. Family members or hired attendants washed, dressed, and arranged the corpse with painstaking attention to propriety. Posture, expression, and clothing were all critical, as the body was expected to appear peaceful, virtuous, and dignified. Cosmetic enhancements were sometimes used, particularly for wealthier families, to ensure that death did not betray disorder, illness, or moral weakness. Even after death, the individual was expected to perform virtue through appearance. Funerals were orchestrated spectacles, balancing mourning, social signaling, and moral display. The order of processions, placement of mourners, and even choice of hearse reflected social status, discipline, and propriety. Music, flowers, and ceremonial rituals were employed to signal respect, morality, and wealth. Any misstep, walking out of line, speaking at the wrong moment, or wearing inappropriate attire could provoke gossip, shame, or moral censure. Funerals were both a personal and social test, demanding the perfect performance from all involved. Children were taught early that death was a moral lesson as well as a natural event. They were instructed in proper behavior around coffins, wakes, and funerals. Curiosity, tears, or mismanaged emotions were closely monitored. Children learned that death demanded observation, reverence, and adherence to rules, instilling in them a lifelong awareness of social expectation and moral obligation. Obituaries and public announcements of death followed strict protocols. Families often crafted them carefully to reflect proper lineage, virtue, and accomplishment. The language used in death notices was moralized, with careful attention to phrasing, order, and omission. Mentioning certain achievements, social connections, or personal qualities signaled status and propriety. Misrepresentation could provoke criticism or ridicule. Even in death, reputation was preserved or potentially tarnished through adherence to rigid societal rules. Widows and widowers had ongoing obligations long after the funeral. Mourning attire persisted, but so did behavior. They were expected to avoid public flirtation, frivolity, or excessive social activity. Travel, new friendships, and remarriage were governed by complex social codes. Timing, manner, and propriety were scrutinized at every turn. Failure to comply risked gossip, exclusion, or loss of status. Victorian society treated grief as a performance of morality, measured continuously, with deviations remembered for years. The etiquette of visiting graves, cemeteries, and memorials was another regulated domain. Even these ostensibly private acts carried public significance. Flowers had to be arranged according to custom. Gestures of mourning, kneeling, bowing, or touching the gravestone had to conform to accepted practices. Improper behavior could reflect not only on the mourner, but on the deceased, suggesting neglect, impropriety, or moral failure. Cemeteries were stages of morality, ritual, and observation. Death also influenced inheritance and property. Wills had to be executed with precision, reflecting societal expectations for fairness, morality, and family continuity. Disputes over property could escalate into public scandals, judged not only legally but morally. Executors, heirs, and family members were constantly scrutinized, their behavior a reflection of both their virtue and the deceased's legacy. Survival of reputation, even beyond death, required careful adherence to social, legal, and moral codes. Hospitals, asylums, and care homes followed similarly strict protocols. The dying were monitored for proper comportment, obedience, and display of virtue. Visitors, staff, and family observed conduct, ensuring that the final moments conformed to societal expectation. Deviation, fear, complaint, or improper expression was interpreted as weakness or moral failing. Death was not only biological, but a performance, requiring vigilance, discipline, and dignity until the very end. Funeral industry workers were also bound by rules. Undertakers, pallbearers, and morticians were expected to maintain professionalism, discretion, and moral awareness. Mistakes could provoke scandal, gossip, or social censure. Even small errors, a poorly placed coffin, a misaligned procession, or improperly handled body, reflected on the morality and competence of all involved. Victorian death was a collective performance, encompassing the deceased, family, and professionals alike. The absurdity of Victorian death rituals provided opportunities for subtle humor and rebellion. Families sometimes bent rules to inject personal preference, irony, or whimsy into ceremonies, though this required careful navigation to avoid censure. Clever gestures, private jokes, or hidden symbols allowed participants to maintain individuality while performing within these suffocating bounds of expectation. Death, like life, demanded intelligence, subtlety, and discretion. Ultimately, Victorian death was inseparable from morality, social status, and performance. It was not enough to die quietly. One had to maintain virtue, dignity, and propriety throughout the process, from the final breath to the last ceremony. Survival in society, even posthumously, depended on meticulous adherence to invisible, absurd, and often contradictory rules. Death was the ultimate stage for moral and social evaluation, a performance that measured character, discipline, and social mastery to the very end. By understanding these rules, we see that Victorian obsession with control, propriety, and morality extended from cradle to grave. Every stage of life, and indeed the transition out of life, demanded performance, vigilance, and adherence to a complex web of expectations. The absurdity and rigor of these regulations highlight a society consumed by perception, virtue, and the relentless judgment of others. As we move into the final chapters, we will explore the residual rules that governed leisure, entertainment, and everyday absurdities, the seemingly minor regulations that, when combined, created a society simultaneously rigid, suffocating, and darkly humorous. Death may have been the grandest stage, but the minutiae of daily life were equally unforgiving. Victorian England's rules touched every corner, creating a world that was simultaneously oppressive, theatrical, and endlessly fascinating. By the time one navigated the rules of life, health, fashion, education, aging, and death in Victorian England, it might seem that nothing remained untouched by societal control. Yet, even the seemingly mundane corners of daily life were suffused with regulation, absurdity, and a kind of dark humor only the Victorians could fully appreciate. Leisure, manners, domesticity, and even private habits were arenas in which morality, class, and proprietary demanded constant attention. In many ways, the minutiae of everyday life were where the strangest, most obsessive rules flourished. Take the dining table, for example. Meals were choreographed performances rather than simple sustenance. The placement of knives, forks, and spoons was governed by invisible hierarchies. The sequence of courses required careful attention. Even the volume of conversation was measured against social expectation. Talking with a mouthful was unthinkable, yet silence was equally suspect, implying disapproval, arrogance, or ignorance. Napkins, cups, and glasses had to be handled with care, demonstrating both discipline and understanding of etiquette. Every meal was simultaneously nourishment and a moral exercise, teaching civility and reinforcing social hierarchy. Even the choice of food itself carried significance. Some dishes were considered virtuous and proper, while others were indulgent or corrupting. Fruits and vegetables were praised for their health and morality. Rich pastries, sweets, and imported delicacies carried undertones of excess or moral laxity. Overindulgence suggested gluttony. Underindulgence implied weakness, and failure to observe the social presentation of dishes, serving at the wrong time, using inappropriate utensils, could provoke subtle judgment. Dining in Victorian England was as much a performance of character as a display of appetite. Tea, that quintessentially British obsession, came with a labyrinthine set of rules. The correct temperature, choice of pot, type of cup, order of service, and even the placement of sugar cubes were all meticulously regulated. Guests and hosts engaged in subtle signaling through gesture, posture, and conversation. Improperly pouring tea, or failing to offer it at the right moment, could imply ignorance, carelessness, or moral failure. Tea was a tool of civility and social observation, a ritualized theater in which every participant performed discipline, grace, and moral understanding. Entertainment was similarly regulated. Visiting the theater, attending concerts, or engaging in social clubs required mastery of subtle codes. Seating arrangements, conversation topics, and even applause had to conform to social expectation. Loud laughter, overt enthusiasm, or improper commentary could betray a lack of refinement or social intelligence. The content of the entertainment itself was carefully scrutinized. Bawdy jokes, excessive romanticization, or political dissent were all frowned upon. Public amusement was permitted only insofar as it adhered to moral and social boundaries, demonstrating awareness and propriety. Home life was another domain of obsessive regulation. Housekeeping demanded constant vigilance. Floors, windows, and surfaces had to be clean, orderly, and aesthetically appropriate. Clutter was a sign of moral weakness, laziness, or poor upbringing. Servants, when present, had to be managed with both discipline and decorum. Mistakes, tardiness, or lapses in appearance reflected not only on the staff, but on the household itself. Even the smallest domestic misstep, a dusty shelf, a crooked curtain, or a mislaid utensil, could provoke social censure or private embarrassment. Letters and correspondence carried their own set of rules. The phrasing, handwriting, stationery, and even the order of closing words signaled social awareness and moral standing. An improperly addressed letter, smudged ink, or overly casual tone could suggest carelessness, moral indifference, or ignorance of societal norms. Writing was thus a constant performance, where clarity, elegance, and propriety were inseparable from social survival. Travel imposed another layer of subtle regulation. When venturing into public spaces, streets, or trains, every gesture, posture, and interaction was subject to observation. Women were expected to maintain modesty, poise, and restraint. Men were judged for composure, control, and awareness of hierarchy. Carriages, public seating, and walking etiquette all carried invisible but rigorously enforced rules. The simple act of moving from one place to another became a moral and social performance, a demonstration of understanding and respect for the societal order. Religion, though central to Victorian morality, also imposed its own precise expectations in daily life. Attendance at church, participation in prayers, and adherence to ritual were all social and moral obligations. Even minor deviations, forgetting a prayer, failing to bow correctly, or misinterpreting a hymn, could be interpreted as lapses in virtue or intelligence. Daily behavior was constantly influenced by spiritual oversight. Charity, honesty, and self-control were not merely desirable, they were enforceable codes woven into the fabric of every interaction. Courtship and flirtation were governed by rules that were simultaneously elaborate, absurd, and ruthlessly enforced. Every glance, gesture, and phrase was analyzed for meaning. Women had to navigate a labyrinth of subtle signals to indicate interest, reserve, or refusal, while men were expected to demonstrate attentiveness, respect, and moral propriety. Missteps, an untimely compliment, a touch on the wrong hand, or an ill-judged bow could derail reputations, block marriage prospects, or spark gossip. Romantic interaction was less about personal desire than a performance of social intelligence and moral discipline. Hygiene remained a persistent obsession throughout daily life. Beyond bathing and cleanliness, even habits like hand-washing, nail trimming, and dental care carried social significance. Neglect implied indiscipline, lack of intelligence, or moral weakness. Personal odor, visible grime, or unkempt appearance could invite whispers, subtle exclusion, or outright judgment. Hygiene was a moral as well as physical responsibility, and mastery of it was essential for survival in Victorian society. Child rearing was governed by similarly rigid rules. Children were expected to obey, perform manners correctly, and demonstrate moral awareness from an early age. Parents were monitored and judged by how well they disciplined their offspring, with misbehavior reflecting poorly on the household's virtue and social standing. Even playtime was regulated, with acceptable activities carefully prescribed to reinforce morality, social hierarchy, and discipline. Childhood was a training ground for navigating the labyrinth of rules that defined Victorian life. Even leisure reading, a private act, was morally coded. Novels, newspapers, and periodicals were selected for virtue, propriety, and edifying content. Romantic, subversive, or sensational material was frowned upon, particularly for young women. Reading was a moral exercise as much as entertainment, a demonstration of judgment, discipline, and social awareness. What one read, how one read, and when one read were all subject to scrutiny, making even private intellectual pursuits a performance of virtue. Humor, subtle rebellion, and clever circumvention were the only relief from the suffocating rules. Individuals learned to navigate the absurdities of Victorian life with discretion. Secret indulgences, whispered jokes, and creative interpretation of regulations allowed survival without complete conformity. Wit and intelligence became survival skills, enabling people to function within the constraints imposed by morality, class, and etiquette while preserving a sense of individuality. By the end of Victorian life, it becomes clear that the rules were totalizing, from birth to death, from fashion to food, from health to leisure. Every aspect of daily existence was regulated by social expectation, morality, and absurdly detailed codes of conduct. Yet, in this rigid world, the Victorians developed ingenuity, subtle rebellion, and humor as tools to survive and thrive. They mastered the art of performance, understanding that appearance, discipline, and decorum were inseparable from social success. The strangest rules of Victorian times were not always written down, yet they governed every facet of life with near absolute authority. They were absurd, suffocating, and sometimes darkly funny. They demanded intelligence, observation, and wit to navigate successfully. But for those who understood them, life in Victorian England was a theater of performance, survival, and subtle mastery, where morality, perception, and etiquette shaped reality at every turn. In the end, what seems most remarkable is not merely the strictness or absurdity of these rules, but the resilience, creativity, and subtle humor of the people who lived under them. They thrived, struggled, rebelled, and conformed, all while performing the intricate choreography of life in one of history's strangest social systems. Victorian England was a society of rules, yes, but also a society of survival, ingenuity, and unexpected wit, a world where even absurdity was a skill to master.